Listen up, fellow babies. This is Hold My Order, Terrible Dresser, the deep dive, history nerd, WKRP, and Cincinnati watch-along podcast. I'm Rob McDougall, and this is my good buddy Mike Grasso.
Hi, everyone.
In this podcast, we enjoy, unpack, and critique the third and fourth episodes of WKRP's first season, Less on a Ledge and Hoodlum Rock.
Bangkok, Moscow, Cincinnati, from the four corners of the world, from the news capitals at home and abroad, the day's headlines brought into focus, the issues and events that shape our time. WKRP, Information Beacon of the Ohio Valley, presents Les Nessman and the News. And up-to-the-minute commentary from one of journalism's most trusted voices, five-time winner of the Buckeye News Hawk Award.
Is that new? I just had it made. Very nice. I like it.
Now here's Les Nessman and the News.
Good morning. This is Les Nessman reporting.
Yeah, Rob, and I want to get us started talking about Less on a Ledge, the capsule description of which would be Les gets accused of being gay by a professional sports player in Cincinnati and ends up on the ledge of the Flim building.
Right, and everybody, except I think Venus and Bailey, tries to talk him down. In the end, the ball player who had Les banned calls and apologizes, and Herb brings Les in off the ledge, but then Herb falls.
He falls Magnolia style down into a net that the fire department has strung out at the bottom of the street.
An off-screen net.
Yeah, which is as good an ending to a sitcom episode as anyone could probably think of in 1978.
And there's also a running joke in the episode in which, in an attempt to get Herb to stop harassing Jennifer, Johnny tells Herb that Jennifer used to be a man.
Which, yeah, I mean, that sort of triggers a lot of hilarity in the studio audience, again, which kind of makes everybody here in 2015 kind of shift uncomfortably in their seats. And, Rob, what do you have to say about, I guess, the sexual politics of Less on a Ledge?
Yeah, I'm sorry we have to start there, but I feel like we have to start there because, to me, this is a great, funny episode with kind of a lousy, no longer funny premise. It's tight. We have one set, 6 characters. It's this perfect little playlet. You can disagree, but I think it's a lot better than the other episode we're talking about today, except for, the huge and unavoidable fact that this is about gay panic, trans panic, and suicide, all played for laughs. It's not that I can't believe that Les would consider suicide if people thought he was gay, because Les is a crazy guy and sitcom characters do lots of goofy things. But, watching this in 2015, I'm asked to sympathize with that decision, and the episode does so little to kind of question it. Oh yeah, of course that's what he would have to do.
I think you're right. I think that definitely Les's character informs this, and I think that probably, again, we'll get to this a little later, but talking about sort of Les being this newsman who doesn't know a whole lot about sports, he has that great note where he says, I've always considered myself a kind of macho kind of guy, which just has all kinds of great tinges in 1978, given the Village People and sort of the rise of macho in the gay community in the late 70s, and sort of he's not really at home in a locker room.
Yeah, it's all done with sympathy, and Les's character, and all the characters are all treated sympathetically. I guess it's fine for 1978. I'm sorry to be kind of Captain Bring Down. It's not that the show endorses suicide, but isn't it funny that people think he's gay and maybe he's going to kill himself? That just sort of, that hangs over this story like a pall for me watching this today. Gay, LGBT youth, I think there's something like 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight peers. That casts a pall. I think in history, the question always comes up. How should we judge historical actors? How should we judge historical texts? Should we judge them by the standards of our own time, what we think is ethical, what we think is skeevy or lame or homophobic? Or should we scrupulously judge them by their own historical context, by the standards of their time? And, to put on my history professor hat for a moment, what I say to my students is the answer is both. You have to do both. If you want any kind of mature engagement with history, you have to judge things by the standards of their own time and by present standards. But keep in mind that those are 2 different things. That's true whether we're tackling some huge historical question like how do we reconcile the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, with America's slaveholding past. But it's also just as true when we're asking, is this goofy old sitcom I love funny, or is it homophobic and out of date? And my answer is yes, it is funny and it is homophobic and out of date. And if you want to have a mature engagement with history, you have to be able to handle both of those at the same time. That said, I laughed. I think it's a great little episode of WKRP.
What's all the excitement about?
Les is out on the ledge.
What?
Listen, Herb, some jerk accused Les of being a homosexual.
A homosexual?
That's right, and you know Les.
Apparently not. At least I didn't know he was, funny.
The word is gay, not funny. And so what if he is? He comes to work, he does his job, he's a fine person. His sex life is his own business.
Sure, you'd say that.
I feel like WKRP is kind of on this edge where it's caught between two time periods, much like the characters in the show are, between sort of conservative and progressive sort of ideas about these things. I mean, as progressive as somebody could be in 1978 about having a gay coworker, you have the spectrum of that within the 6 characters you mentioned in the intro.
That's right. And they put that point of view in. Jennifer, notably, is kind of the voice of reason and tolerance. She does say, so what if he is gay? Now the idea that Jennifer was a man is, of course, just a laugh. Nobody in the episode says, what if she was a man? But that's a lot to ask for 1978.
It honestly, a lot of humor comes from discomfort. There was a great theory about the idea of humor being a benign violation. Some sort of social norm or mores gets violated, but in a way that doesn't harm anyone. And I think in 1978, to the mainstream straight cis audience, this is a benign violation. But obviously to anybody who's gay who's watching the show, it kind of makes them feel uncomfortable. And again, we're in the point in 2015 where this is no longer a benign violation. It's one that kind of goes against the social norm. It is kind of interesting that Herb ends up having 2 trans plot lines during the course of WKRP. He's got this one, and then he's got the Dayton Poisoner episode in a couple of seasons.
Oh, yeah.
Where his former high school football teammate, he meets him, her at that point, years later, and she's a woman.
And there really is a trans plot line. That's right. This was just really a joke, throwaway joke in this episode, but I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah.
When you were just talking, I thought, what if in our alternate universe in our minds, Jennifer had been a man? What if we were to watch the whole rest of the series assuming that was canon, that Jennifer had in fact had gender reassignment surgery? In that case, this would go from being this off-key, no longer politically correct joke to being a historic, groundbreaking, positive portrayal of a trans woman on American television.
This is Jennifer, reminding you not to touch that dial or anything else.
So having said all that, I got to say that Frank Bonner, Herb, kills it in this episode.
And I had that down too. Yes, his physical comedy is great. And I got to be honest with you, I love the part where it was really heartbreaking when Herb says, Les is my best friend, I'm going to help him.
Sure. Yeah. That was great. Just, his long reaction shot after Johnny tells him about Jennifer's sex change. Then him peeking out the door and slamming it in her face. And then, there's a moment where he inhales and crumples a bunch of papers in his face when she's talking to him. Just these little touches. Even the way he says, a homosexual, like Sideshow Bob,
Oh, God. Yeah, that's true. I had down both Hessman and Bonner's physical comedy in this episode was fantastic.
Moving away from just the politics of this and my discomfort with the politics of this, I have a couple of questions for you about this episode, and both of them take the form, was this thing a thing? So first of all, as we record this on Super Bowl Sunday,
yep,
we are both nerds, but I think you are more of the kind of Bill Simmons, Chuck Klosterman persuasion where you can be a nerd and still be into sports, and I really respect that. So I'm going to ask you, also as a New Englander, because the reporter in the locker room thing was a thing, right? Like questions about women reporters in the locker room and appropriate behavior.
Yep.
And I don't know about gay reporters, but what's the story there?
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned this. We always try to look back at what was going on in 1978. I feel like the producers of that FX show, The Americans, where they have that wall where they put all the news stories from the early 80s. And we've been looking back at what was going on at this time. We talked about Kiss last week and how this was like the era of peak Kiss. 1978 was actually the first year that women got equal access to the locker room after games in the United States. It was a federal court decision. The NFL actually didn't institute an official equal access policy until, of course, 7 years later, because as we know, the NFL is full of backwards-thinking troglodytes. And that all came to a head in 1990, while I was in high school here in New England. A reporter in Boston named Lisa Olson basically came in during one of the first seasons of the New England Patriots season, the NFL season, and basically was sexually harassed by a couple of Patriots players in the locker room. And it, kind of exploded into
the Patriots are a great bunch of young men. I mean, everybody agrees on that across America, right? They're just an upstanding bunch of young fellows.
Here's the problem. Back in the early 90s, they didn't even have the benefit of being a winning team. Not only were they losers personally, they were losers professionally as well. So it was kind of a double whammy. They were owned at that time by a man named Victor Kayam, who was... he went out in front of a banquet, a male-only sports banquet, later in that year, actually a little bit later in that winter, in 1991, during the Gulf War, and said, what do Lisa Olson and the Iraqis have in common? They've both seen Patriot missiles up close.
Oh, so classy and topical, too.
The classic sort of, let's start this speech with a really funny joke. And then that got out.
Yeah, keep it classy.
And that reignited the entire controversy. Lisa Olson, unfortunately, ended up leaving the country after this. She ended up becoming a reporter in Australia. So I think it's...
Oh, did she sort of get attacked or scapegoated?
She was very much professionally blackballed, and there was a settlement. And there were fines, which later on, apparently, sports reporters told us that those fines towards the NFL players actually were never actually levied. So they actually got off scot-free for doing this to her. And she had to leave the country, basically just humiliated by the entire experience. And she went to cover Australian rules football and rugby in Australia, which marks one of the first times in human history where Australia was considered a more progressive country than another. So
the only thing I don't get about this whole thing is the importance of the locker room, which is to say, political reporters don't insist on interviewing politicians while they're changing.
Yep.
I get that they spend a lot of time in the locker room, but couldn't all these interviews be held just outside the locker room, elsewhere in the stadium? Is it really that hard to find a place where people can chit-chat?
Well, what you are talking about here is a kind of deeply, very, very historically held belief among sports reporters that you've got to get the interview after the game. It's a very, I'll go so far to say call it a homosocial sort of vibe.
Yeah.
There's this is kind of gross, but there's this sports radio around here uses a term for reporters who get a little too into their subjects who are athletes. They call them jock sniffers. It's sort of this really weird kind of vibe where the reporter really wants to be an athlete and wants to be with the guys and with his buddies, and the entrance of a woman or a gay reporter into that milieu obviously is really threatening. We saw it with the Michael Sam case, the first openly gay NFL player to be drafted, and how players were falling all over themselves to say, oh, I'm not prejudiced, but I don't want him in my locker room. It's a very threatening thing for a lot of these ball players. I would argue it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be, but the door was opened by women reporters in the late 70s and early 80s who insisted on having equal access, because if it is a journalistic reason for you to be there immediately after the game to get immediate reactions, absolutely women should be involved. Absolutely gay reporters should be involved. There's another incident that happened here in Boston only a few years ago. Boston Herald sports reporter by the name of Steve Buckley. Great guy, very, very affable dude who has been on the main sports radio station here in Boston for about 20 years as a guest host. He came out of the closet 3 years ago. He's in his late 50s. He's been, again, a sports reporter in Boston for 20 plus years. And this station, who has a bunch of hosts who have used gay and trans jokes on the regular, had to deal with the fact that one of their best friends and closest work colleagues was gay, and it really caused a sea change in the way a lot of the hosts, not all of them, but a lot of the hosts on this sports radio station treated Steve. They still were able to joke around with him because he's one of these sports guys who loves old-time baseball, like Ken Burns, sort of, I love, the 1910s and sort of Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth era. So they still joke around with him, but all of a sudden, this new element has been introduced into, again, this very closed off, sectioned off part of sort of the straight man's, milieu. And all of a sudden, they have to deal with this reality, quote unquote, intruding on them. And the reactions, I thought, were fascinating. I thought a lot of the sports hosts on this station were having to hold back how they really felt.
You wanted to see me?
Oh, yes, of course we do, Les. Look, would you just sit down right over here, please? Right here in the chair. Because Herb has something that he wants to tell you. Come on, Andy, let's you and I
No, you and I should both stay.
leave. Okay, Herb, you tell him.
Les, Jennifer's a guy.
What?
That's what I said.
Oh, yeah, listen, Herb, thank you very much for telling us that. Now go to your office, will you?
Surely. Look, if you guys need any more help, just let me know.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so the other question I wanted to ask, I don't know if you have an answer, but was the ledge episode a thing? Like the guy on a ledge being talked down from committing suicide?
It certainly feels like it was more of a regular sort of go-to plot back again in this time period. I sort of put your characters in a pressure cooker type of situation.
Yeah, it's a great obviously an immediate kind of tense situation, and one that you can do with a very simple set and no special effects, as we saw in this episode. I feel like I'm sure the internet could, and some Googling and some TV troping could answer this. In the misty part of my mind, I feel like I remember ledge episode of Night Court, maybe one of Welcome Back, Kotter.
There was a Welcome Back, Kotter episode. I do remember that one. It was actually, I think Horshack had to talk a girl down. She was just a guest character.
Welcome Back, Kotter, which was opposite WKRP in this first season. They were dueling for that Monday night slot.
Huh.
Maybe Barney Miller.
Barney Miller had multiple off-camera talking.
Off-camera. Everything was off-camera in Barney Miller. Yeah, and this, maybe I'm the only person in the world that remembers this, but did you ever watch Hooperman? This is John Ritter's late 1980s sort of dramedy. It was one of the dramedies that was a thing that year, along with the, I thought, really great Dabney Coleman show, Slap Maxwell. Mm-hmm. But Hooperman was he talking down the suicidal?
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah. I'd like to thank TV Tropes for having a talking down the suicidal page, because I'll tell you, that'll save your bacon every time, TV Tropes.
What have they got?
Well, they've got Hooperman, they've got multiple episodes of Barney Miller, including one where Fish was unsuccessful in talking somebody off from the ledge, but at the same time delivered a baby at the precinct, combining two sitcom tropes in one, but one of them with tragic consequences, which is Barney Miller in a nutshell. I mean, one of the sitcoms I mentioned last week as the grungy, realistic late 70s sitcoms. But
right, I think of this as the Bronze Age of sitcoms, and Barney Miller. If there was going to be an episode where the person did jump, Barney Miller, Taxi, they're all about 5 minutes away from jumping off a ledge on that show too. But
12 Precinct Fish. Where? The Mercantile Building? What floor is he on? The 15th? Yeah, that could kill him, I guess. Did you tell him that suicide was not the answer and he's got a lot to live for and all that malarkey? He didn't buy it. Well, what did you want? A piece of what? Oh, just plain Pete. Well, see if you can get a net under him and we'll get someone over. Honey, there's a wacko on a ledge on the Mercantile Building who says he's going to jump unless there's peace in the Mideast before midnight.
The man's in a lot of trouble.
You should explain the whole Bronze Age thing for those folks who aren't maybe comic book fans. I think that might be valuable, just a capsule of what that means.
Sure. Maybe I'll do a longer rant on this sometime when I'm prepared, but just in my addled mind, sitcoms match up pretty well to the so-called ages of comic books. So we have the golden age, comic books or the golden age sitcoms of the 1950s would be like Leave It to Beaver and maybe The Honeymooners, or the sort of the beginning of the form. And then there's definitely a silver age. In the 60s, sitcoms get really weird and fantastic. So Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie and
My Favorite Martian.
And so, they make the domestic strange and the strange domestic, really offbeat, crazy, weird. Then I think the 70s sitcoms are marked by more political relevance, with your sort of Norman Lear, All in the Family type shows, but also, just as we're saying, this kind of sort of a gritty and often a kind of sad quality. Taxi, Barney Miller, and sometimes WKRP have a kind of a pathos around them.
Hi, Andy.
Yeah, hi, how you doing, Les? Listen, come on in and let's talk, okay?
There's no point in talking, Andy.
Oh, of course there is.
I've always considered myself a fairly macho kind of guy. Now my reputation is ruined. And my reputation is all that I am.
Look, Les, we'll go down to the stadium. We'll talk with those guys.
Even if we did, there'd always be a black mark beside my name, which time cannot erase.
He's starting to get poetic. Is that a good sign? I don't know.
So what I would love to talk about next, we alluded to this earlier, but let's talk a little bit about what we learn about our cast members. This is the first episode after the pilot. What other sort of observations did you make about the characters in this episode?
Well, obviously, Les is at the center of this episode,
right,
and we get a lot more about him. The episode opens, I think, with the famous Chai Rodriguez. And also that terrific, for a moment of characterization that really defines the character, when Les has the cart of the opening for his newscast and pops it in London, Moscow, Cincinnati. And there's a nice little visual comedy when he sits down, then gets up, and Johnny does a double take as he gets up because the still has 30 seconds to go. That's a great radio gag because, to use the radio cart, the little intro that he had made for himself as this window into the kind of, his personality, the kind of newsman he wants to be. And then the contrast when it says, Les Nessman and the news. And then he comes in and says, I'm Les Nessman. It's a funny redundancy, but it also, there's his character right there. It's
fantastic. I think if we looked at our respective notes, we haven't really been sharing them before the actual podcast, but I have this feeling we'd have about a 90% overlap because, it really gives you this capsule idea of Les's delusions of grandeur, I guess is the best way to put it. And again, the fact that the idea of him being this world-class newsman can coexist with the idea of him mispronouncing the winner of a golf tournament and doing, his prize-winning pig report. For Les, there's no contrast there. They're both part of the same tapestry. I loved when Les was on the ledge and declaiming Shakespeare. In this episode, you almost get the feeling he's a frustrated actor and, somebody who maybe majored in journalism after he didn't quite make summer stock, you know what I mean? He's got Hamlet's soliloquy memorized. The big guy has to go in and look up fartles, which I think is just one of these great sort of there's this old Dilbert cartoon about what are some inherently funny words, and fartles definitely is high on that list, and bodkin, of course.
Herb tells him to look up bodkin, too.
But, Les, you get this idea that maybe he does dream of something more. Maybe the idea of him having his journalistic career taken away from him by this rumor, all of his dreams now are coming crashing to the ground. There is a lot of pathos, and there is a lot of sadness, and the idea of Les having a depth to him that goes beyond him, being a silly, ineffectual newsman with a Band-Aid on a different part of his body every week. He's got an inner life that we get a glimpse of in this episode. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Pretty good for episode 3.
So exciting. That was Scum of the Earth's new hit. And now let's rap to these heavy dudes here live in person. This is Venus Flytrap, one-on-one with Scum. Welcome to Cincinnati, guys.
We hate Cincinnati.
Huh?
We don't like this studio much either.
Well, great. On to episode 4, called Hoodlum Rock. The basic plot of which is it's one of these early episodes of WKRP where they're striving to find an angle in the ultra-competitive Cincinnati radio scene, and they're going to sponsor their first rock concert. A rock concert by British Hoodlum Rock band Scum of the Earth. Rob, what did you think of the episode Hoodlum Rock?
I'm sorry to say that this one does not work for me. While the other episode, had this sort of out-of-date premise, but still really just earned my love by being really tight and really funny, this one, the premise is fine. It's a logical, obvious premise, but I just couldn't buy it. The jokes didn't land for me. And, Scum of the Earth, the idea of the punk band or the hoodlum band that, they wear suits and they speak with Eton accents, yet despite that, they're a big pain in the ass. I just found them, completely unconvincing as a punk band. And I found it completely unconvincing. Why is everyone in the station so afraid of them? It's supposed to be a episode about rock and roll excess, but these terrifying young hoodlums, who aren't that young, by the way, that's part of the problem. These terrifying middle-aged hoodlums, what actually do they do? Well, they kind of goof on an interview, horrors, and then the guy dumps a salad on his head.
Yeah, and I think we should probably give some context for this episode because, again, historically, this would have been actually kind of early in the punk scene, again, for a lot of middle America to understand what punk rock was. I think in Britain at this point, obviously, the Sex Pistols were everywhere. The Ramones had made their famous visit a few years ago. The Clash were on the rise. So a British audience could have handled probably a full-on punk band on a TV show. But I think at this point in America, especially middle America, it wouldn't have penetrated that deeply. And I think one of the things that the producers and the writers realized, as we found out reading an old, I believe it was Wall Street Journal article, is that it's tough to parody punk rock because punk rock itself is kind of a comment on the decay of society. So when the writers were trying to put together this episode, they realized there wasn't a whole lot that was funny about it.
Yes, so this great article from the Wall Street Journal actually came out on the day that WKRP premiered, sort of describing how a show makes it to air. But the episode that they are filming at the time the reporter is there was the Hoodlum Rock Scum of the Earth episode. And it says here, it describes how the episode isn't working and Hugh Wilson is really stressed and the jokes aren't landing and he feels embarrassed about the physical comedy, the scene where Mr. Carlson sits on a pie. And it says here, finally, it is decided that the satire doesn't work because punk rock is a put-on to begin with. So the rock singers are instructed to use upper-class Etonian accents and mannerisms, which it is hoped will contrast with their churlish behavior. So they kind of flip it. And actually, I saw an interview online where one of the actor/musicians who plays Scum of the Earth, Michael Elbling, he says that it was his idea to flip it.
Yeah. And you know what? That answers a lot of questions for me, Rob, because to me, this episode was hilarious, but I have to admit, I'm a bit of an Anglophile, especially comedy-wise. This felt more like a Monty Python sketch than an American sitcom. The idea of a guy putting a salad on his head as this very threatening thing actually really tickled me. I thought it was really funny because it is that sort of understated silliness that you will see in a Monty Python sketch like The Silly Election, or Ministry of Silly Walks. It's not threatening at all. I can agree with you on that. But to me, it was hilarious. And what it really evoked to me more than anything was what would happen 4 years later when Spinal Tap would come out. I'm not comparing the two. Don't get me wrong. I know Spinal Tap's a masterpiece, and this is not. But it really kind of got to that sort of central, rock and roll is kind of silly, and trashing your hotel room is kind of childish. But that was, to me, kind of the sort of charm of the episode was, yeah, they're not really very threatening, and that's kind of funny.
Anyway, let's go straight over to James Gilbert at Leicester.
Well, it's a straight fight here at Leicester. On the left of the returning officer, you can see Arthur Smith, the sensible candidate, and his agent. And on the other side is the silly candidate, Jethro Walrus Titty, with his agent and his wife.
Here is the result for Leicester. Arthur J. Smith.
Sensible party.
30,612. Jethro Q. Walrus Titty.
Silly party.
32,108.
Well, there's the first result, and the silly party have held Leicester. What do you make of that, Norman?
Well, this is largely as I predicted, except that the silly party won. I think this is mainly due to the number of votes cast. Gerald?
Well, there's a swing here to the silly party, but how big a swing, I'm not going to tell you.
And, again, for a sitcom, you're not going to have a punk group shooting up heroin in the lobby with, right next to Jennifer, or, smearing stuff on the walls.
Yeah. There's no way they could match That's probably part of the problem they have. But the show usually or often plays the cool characters off against the squares. And here we are, only 4 episodes in, and Johnny and Venus and Andy are already uncool and unhip enough to be freaked out by these completely non-threatening guys. It rubs me the wrong way.
But it does lead to a great bit right near the end of the episode where the big guy and Andy are kind of trading stories about whatever happened to music, whatever happened to Glenn Miller and whatever happened to Crosby, Stills and Nash, and they have that bonding moment where they're putting the cotton in their ears. And
yes, that's a nice part. I think it's Benny Goodman that Mr. Carlson misses.
Oh, it's Benny Goodman, yeah.
And Andy misses Chicago and Crosby, Stills and Nash, which what I take from that little bit, which I did love, is that Carlson, knew how to swing back in his day, but Andy really is boring. I mean, middle of the road Altamore vintage rock.
Who got us where we are today? It was your generation. Now you people have your finger on the button, ready to blow the whole joint to bits, and you're telling us to cool it?
Not so many years ago, there was a generation of young people who were as mad as you are about the world. Only they worked their tails off to change it. Trying to end a war they didn't believe in, trying to correct injustices that they saw. But all you do is gripe.
Okay, in WKRP's defense, television really did not know what to do with punk rock. Did you ever see or have you heard of, there was an infamous punk rock episode of the show Quincy MD?
Yeah, I remember probably seeing clips of it on YouTube more than remembering seeing it. I mean...
Oh, yeah, I didn't watch it.
Quincy was a very long-running show with a lot of episodes. And
right. Well, so in this one, Quincy, who is, as you know, an MD, investigates the dangerous, sordid world of punk rock. And I actually see that Melora Hardin, she was on The Office as Jan, Michael's girlfriend Jan. Yeah. She plays a teenage girl sucked into this violent, nihilistic world. It was so bad, I think, that Quincy Punk actually became a kind of nickname or catchphrase in the punk community, meaning a phony punk or a poser is a Quincy Punk for years to come.
She comes home and she finds her daughter burning cigarette holes in her arm, shredding her clothes to bits, taking pills, and locking herself in a room listening to that violence-oriented punk rock music. You've got to see it with your own eyes to believe it, Quince. I've seen children come off that dance floor with crushed ribs and bloody faces, like soldiers fighting some kind of insane war.
What could persuade a kid to act like that?
Maybe the greatest persuader there is. Music.
That is fantastic. I really like that. It reminds me of a couple of things. First of all, it reminds me of the version of Dragnet from the late 60s with Jack Webb and Colonel Potter in it.
Oh, wow.
And how many episodes did they have about crazy hippies leaving their kids out to die and like taking acid and jumping off a bridge and, just completely out of touch with of course, completely out of touch by design because it's Jack Webb we're talking about here.
It is, but this is one of the things that was cool about WKRP in 1978 is that television had, on the whole, been so bad in dealing with rock and roll culture. Mm-hmm. And usually it was this kind of like issue episodes about the, rock and roll threat or menace kind of thing. And so, which is again, why it's a little bit disheartening to me to see punk kind of handled so roughly in this one.
The other thing that Quincy Punk reminds me of is that very famous Volkswagen commercial from the early 90s with Jeremy Davies saying, "This car is like punk rock," which became...
Punk rock car.
That was the moment that grunge died, I think. It wasn't when Kurt Cobain shot himself. It was when Volkswagen did a commercial where they said, "This car is like punk rock." I think all of us realized at that point, it's over, pack it up, let's all go home.
I'll talk to you about my new Subaru Impreza and explain its relevance to you and me and the car business, okay? Okay. This car is like punk rock. Now, just trust me, this is relevant. Do you remember when rock and roll was really boring and corporate? Well, punk challenged all this and said, "Hey, excuse me, but here's what's cool about music," remember? Now, Subaru, with this Impreza, is challenging some car thinking here. This car is all about reminding you and me what's great about a car and moving forward and making cars better and less disappointing. Just like punk, except it's cars.
Well, given all that, Rob, I mean, it kind of makes me want to ask, what would you do to kind of make this episode a success? If you were thrown back in time to that writer's room we read about in the Wall Street Journal article, what would you do?
I'm glad you asked me that, and I wish that somebody would throw me back in time. A lot of writers' rooms, I have a lot of good ideas. So here's two things I thought of, two ways you could have flipped this. One way would be have them look like punks, big, scary mohawk, combat boots, safety pins in their face, and have them be young, because there's a generational thing going on here that totally doesn't work when the band is all the same age as well-preserved classic rockers. But then have the joke be that they look scary, but they really are shy and polite. So the promoters want them to go crazy and trash hotel rooms and spit on their audience, but they're like quiet Juilliard students with classical music training, and the most they can bring themselves to do is dump out a salad. Right. So then you flip it in reverse. I could have bought that, where you make the joke the fact that they really aren't that threatening. Or another way to do it, because I do think that they were kind of out of their element with punk, is make the band a Zeppelin clone. Go full Spinal Tap. Make them sort of pompous and theatrical, trying to seem occult and mysterious. That, Spinal Tap, not saying they could have hit those levels, but that's comedy gold. And that would have been in Hugh Wilson's wheelhouse, in Howard Hessman's wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But I think maybe it was 1978 and that seemed old hat, and somebody said, what's happening in music today? Oh, there's this punk rock thing. We got to get on that.
Why would anybody want to listen to music that makes you hate when you can listen to music that makes you love?
But we talked about Led Zeppelin. We should talk about the Scum of the Earth themselves, because as you saw in their last two numbers, they are a Bad Company Zeppelin-style outfit. And they were an actual real band. They were a band called Detective.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I thought it would make sense to make the band a Zeppelin clone is that the band is, in fact, played by a Zeppelin clone. Mike, you did a little research. Do you want to tell us about Detective?
There's not a whole lot of research to report on them. They were a band signed to Swan Song Records, actually. That's Led Zeppelin and Peter Grant's record label, which didn't honestly have a whole lot of different bands. They had Zeppelin near the end, and they had Detective, and they had Bad Company, and that's about it.
I think I saw online the band described as professional Zeppelin hangers-on Detective.
That is a great way to put them, because they are kind of, again, maybe not as prominent as a lot of the bands of this era, but they were at the center of a lot. The lead singer who played Dog, Michael DeBar, he's probably more famous for having a famous wife, and that is legendary rock groupie Pamela DeBar,
right,
who has made a sort of a post-groupie career out of telling tales out of school. I think justifiably, her history is just fantastic. I mean, I want to ask you what it must be like to be discovered by Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart. To start your groupie career with those two guys must have been a very weird sort of groupie career to have.
Well, I don't know if I can answer what it's like to be discovered by Captain Beefheart and Frank Zappa, but I'm flattered that you would ask me that. Yeah, she's like... Now, I don't know how much of this is her self-promotion, but to believe the back of her book, she is like, Pamela DeBar is like the 70s rock groupie, right?
Absolutely.
Who just sort of had, slept with everyone, or at least got backstage with everyone and slept with many of them, has lots of tales to tell. She's, sometimes associated with the Penny Lane character in the movie Almost Famous, although I think that Cameron Crowe has said, no, that's a different groupie that he was in love with as a kid. But nevertheless, she is an archetype of this character.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think back to Almost Famous, and I think back to the riot at the Hyatt scene where behind every door is a different famous rocker. You've got that kid kind of introduces you. Led Zeppelin's over there, Bowie's over there, Stillwater's over here. It's like you get that feeling that Detective were probably in one of the shittier rooms in that hotel, sort of trying to get an audition to tour with either Zeppelin or Kiss or someone like that. And
yeah. And that's the world that these guys know. That's the world that Hugh Wilson and these guys know. But that was 1973.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pretty good book. I haven't read Pamela DeBar's book. I was kind of embarrassed to check it out at the library. But what I did read is this book called What You Want Is in the Limo by Michael Walker. And I can't remember the subtitle, but he follows 3 iconic 1973 rock tours. One by The Who, one by Led Zeppelin, and one by Alice Cooper. And it's just this great history reconstruction of that world. And and all the stories that you really want to hear. That world is, ripe for parody, a world of excess and debauchery and that kind of thing. It's a fun read.
You and I are mortal, but rock and roll will never die.
Now that's just where you're wrong, Bobby. Recent studies show that rock and roll is in fact dying.
What?
Popular music has been on the wane since 1974, the year of the first Bad Company release.
I have that album.
Of course you do, Bob.
Speaking of Cincinnati, it might be time for what I think could well become a recurring segment, which is on this podcast, which is This Week in Cincinnati Weirdness, Conspiracy, or Elliptony. And of course, I am talking about the Cincinnati Triangle.
Were you listening to Johnny as you drove in this morning?
Sure.
But he's doing bogus news reports, Andy. It's very dangerous, you know.
Well, like what?
Well, he's telling the listeners there's this thing called the Cincinnati Triangle. It's just like the Bermuda Triangle, except it runs from Cincinnati up to Dayton, over to Columbus and back. He's reporting that things have begun to disappear from the Cincinnati Triangle.
What kind of things?
Well, so far, 2 recreational vehicles and Woody Hayes.
Mike?
Yeah, obviously this rang alarm bells for me when it came up as this hoax story that Johnny was putting out on the air, because both of us are such big fans of weirdness, the supernatural, the occult, and sort of all that kind of stuff that I guess in the late 70s really was a real thing. I mean, you had In Search Of, you had endless UFO books and tabloids and documentaries, and so every week we'll try to find something in WKRP. I feel like the writers have a little bit of a conspiracy tinge to them as well.
So the Cincinnati Triangle, Les tells us, is like the Bermuda Triangle, but runs from Cincinnati up to Dayton and over to Columbus.
Yeah, we plotted this on Google Maps. It's a very obtuse, sort of narrow triangle, but it's not an area of Ohio where a lot goes on, which I think is kind of the perfect... At the middle, smack dab in the middle of it is Xenia, Ohio, which is a great sort of weird name.
It is. It appears to be centered on Xenia, Ohio. I don't know anything special or significant about Xenia, but obviously that deserves further investigation.
I did actually take the liberty, Rob, of going back through Charles Fort's 4 books. I downloaded some searchable versions of them. I was looking for Ohio instances of disappearances.
Good man. You see, people listening, we are doing our homework here.
We take it real seriously. So in Wild Talents, he does mention that in the town of Lebanon, Ohio, which is, again, almost smack dab near the middle of the putative Cincinnati Triangle, there was an instance of a shop owner who had birdshot falling from the ceiling of his shop with no apparent source, which I love that. Like, where is it coming from? Everybody just looked up and saw, I don't know where the birdshot's coming from. Apparently, the owner of the shop, John Lingo, shot an intruder 5 years previous, and this apparently was deemed to be some sort of post-event haunting of the traumatic event of him putting some birdshot into the backside of an intruder, a burglar, which
wow.
You couldn't ask for a better, sort of more homely sort of example of Fortiana than, a shop owner giving an intruder the what for.
Right. It's not exactly a rain of blood or a plague of frogs or something.
In these 2 episodes, Johnny really is kind of like this chaos figure at the station. He starts trouble. He loves telling hoax stories. He's kind of the chaos Muppet of the cast. I think we've both talked about the
trickster figure,
the order versus chaos Muppet theory, which we'll have to send a link to after we record this. But the idea that there's, in the cast of the Muppets there, you can basically sort them into 2 different kinds of Muppets. The order Muppets who are like your Berts and your chaos Muppets who are like your Ernies. And Johnny is the Loki of this particular pantheon.
That's good. That's a different way of cutting through the cast than the suits and the dungarees, because Andy is one of the hip, young, dungaree-wearing members of the staff, but he's clearly also an order Muppet.
That's actually perfect. I think we should investigate that in further episodes.
What was that? It's called the medium sketch.
The medium sketch?
Yeah, it wasn't rare, and it certainly wasn't well done.
My Order, Terrible Dresser is recorded before a live studio audience.